Ladies and gentlemen, hi. We're ready to begin. Kindly silence your cell phones, or risk the wrath of the crowd later on when it rings. Please welcome to another YIVO lecture sponsored by the Max Weinreich Center. We're pleased to welcome today Professor Shaul Stampfer. He is the Rabbi Edward Sandro Professor of Soviet and East European Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Emeritus. And today he will be speaking on the myth of the Khazar conversion and the origin of the Ashkenazi Jews. And I will leave it at that. And use you, Dr. Stampfer. I'm sorry?
Any way you can make it less hot in this room?
I don't believe there's. I think it's central
maybe
air.
Put down the shades, it may help.
Oh, I could do that, sure.
Open the window, right?
So,
Some of us are hard of hearing.
you'll hear me, don't worry.
Thank you.
You will probably hear more of me than you wish, but you'll
But I
hear.
understand your accent.
Okay. I am very honored and happy to be invited to speak here. To be absolutely honest, I begged for an invitation, and my begging worked and got me an invitation. So here I am. I want to speak about two separate topics, both of which I think are somewhat important, not very important, but somewhat important. And I will try to do this within a relatively limited period of time. Sometimes when I talk about these topics, people say, it's very interesting, I'd like to hear more about it. So then I tell them I wrote some articles and you can read about it, and then there's silence. Now, the truth is, I did write some articles, and I will not be able to say everything that is in the articles, which is for better or for worse, but I'll try to answer some questions at the end, but it might well be necessary for me to say, if you really want to learn more about it, you can read what I wrote. In the meantime, you can believe me, what I said is true. Okay. Now, I want to deal, I think it'd be more effective with the second element of my topic first, and then I'll move up to the question of the Khazars. Now, there seems to be some interest in knowing where did the Jews of Eastern Europe come from. And there are all types of theories about the background of East European Jewry, where they came and how they came. Now, I think the most useful way to look at this topic is to come without looking for demographic miracles or miraculous escape from persecution, but to consider a little bit about how populations grow and develop. And here, one of the best ways to do this is to look at a credit card statement. You buy money on the credit card, just pay, the plastic works. At the end of the month, you've got to come up and pay. And if you don't pay, then the next month, the amount you owe grows. And what's important is that there's interest on the interest. If people do not keep control of debt, it balloons because it grows and grows and without end. Populations are the same way. You have a population in 100 people in the course of a year, 3 or 4 babies. Mazal tov, very nice. But if this continues every year, the population grows very quickly. Population moving at a pace of about 2% in the course of 30 years doubles itself. And then, in 30 years later, after 16 years, they're already 4 times the size of the original population. Populations grow very, very quickly. If one looks at the population of Quebec, now, if you're asking, wait, did I come for a lecture on the Khazars? The answer is yes. I'll get to it. But first, if you look at the population of Quebec, there are about 6 million people speaking French. What is their background? They're not descendants of the Iroquois. They're not descendants of other Indian groups. They are all descended from about 5,000 Frenchmen who came on small boats from France to North America in the 17th century. However, they came to a place with good water, sufficient food, lack of infectious diseases other than syphilis, and the population grew very, very quickly to 6 million without any miracles. This is the way populations grow if there's no limit. The net population of the Afrikaans speakers in South America, in South Africa, the descendants of migrants from Holland, it's also about 2.5 million descendants of about 2,000 people. That's all who came from Holland to South Africa. Populations can grow far faster than we ever imagined. If you want to see a horror story in front of your eyes, go to Egypt today and you see what happens when a population doubles and doubles and doubles. Now, the population of the Jews in Eastern Europe on the eve of World War I was millions. But that doesn't mean that there was a huge population that came to Eastern Europe. What seems to be the case is that the number of Jews who came to Eastern Europe in the 15th, 16th centuries was a very, very small population. And here we have to enlist various tools to try to reconstruct what happened, because we have no documents, we have no passports from the early modern period, we don't have lists of migrants. We have to use our heads instead of looking in archives. So, for example, if one considers the Yiddish of Eastern European Jewry, it's quite different from the Yiddish of West European Jews. Certain words are indeed quite familiar. We have the word parv, which comes from the Latin parus, equal, so it's both for bread, meat, and milk. We have chont, which comes from hot. Clearly, Eastern European Yiddish is tied very much to Western European Yiddish, but there are also very sharp differences from Western and East European Yiddish, and there are experts who know far more than I do who can clarify, but the fact is one which is well known. Now, this raises a certain question. Had there been a mass flight of Jews from, let's say, Magensa or Mainz or Wormisa or Worms, one of the places where Jewish communities were decimated, had there been mass flight to Eastern Europe, one would not have expected the Yiddish to be so different. Not only that, the names that we find are different names, and we also find differences in the prayer service and the davening. The minhagim of Eastern Europe are similar to those of what is now Austria, Bohemia, Moravia, they're not similar to the area of the Rhine Valley. Saying all of this in the halls of Max Weinreich, I realize is a bit of a chutzpah, but people who live in Israel, sometimes it happens without even noticing. There are some very significant differences. And here we have to consider, how does most migration take place? Basically, people do not like to move from one place to another unless they're reasonably certain that the move is going to improve their lives. The key factor is information. If you know that in a certain place there are jobs, housing is reasonably priced, it's safe, the weather is good, then it'll be attractive. If the conditions exist but there's a lack of knowledge, people are not going to risk everything to go and to try out a new place and then to find out it won't work. For the Jews living in the Rhine Valley in central Germany, the information they had on Poland was indeed quite limited, and had they had information, they certainly would not have gone to Poland. The economic potential of Poland was limited. The living conditions were very, very rough in the Middle Ages. If one has to leave the heartland of Ashkenazi Jewry, Italy would have been a much better choice than the East. And as a matter of fact, where were some of the earliest Yiddish books printed? In northern Italy. There are very good reasons for that, in addition to Italian food. But I would not discuss that. So that from Germany, the place to move is more to the south, to the east. However, there was a factor which created difficulties. In the mid-14th century, there was, of course, the terrible Black Plague, which decimated populations all through Europe and led to incredible persecutions of Jews, so that the population dropped. The area of Bohemia and Moravia was apparently much less affected by the plague. There were cases, but it did not have a dramatic impact. Apparently, the rats that spread the plague with the fleas on their backs did not like the area of Czechoslovakia today, Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, certainly Poland. The Black Plague didn't get there. The result was that the populations were less affected or not affected at all, and the Jewish population in this region grew and grew, growing more than the non-Jewish population, which created economic pressures. You want to know why the population grew more than the non-Jews? Tell this gentleman here that you would like him to invite me to come back. I promise I will tell you. But that is another topic. But the population did grow, and what do you do when population grows? You have to look for a new place to live. So that if you're in the Bohemian, Moravian lands, which are very close to Poland, there are constant trade connections between Prague and Krakow, the buying and selling across the lines. The Jews in that region knew quite well what were the opportunities in Eastern Europe, and what seems to happen is that one person heard there was a possibility to make a living in Krakow. He went, he did all right, he wrote his cousin told his brother, they came 3 years later. It's a question of small numbers of people constantly coming to Poland. Now, or to the Polish lands. Now, when they arrived in the Polish lands at cities like Krakow, now here I don't even know what to say, Lvov or Lviv, depending on the political orientation, Lublin. These cities were cities with German-speaking populations. And the German speakers came from all over the German-speaking lands, from southern Germany, northern Germany. There were many from Holland. And they spoke a gibberish of German, which was called later colonial German, which was a mixture. The Jews came in their small numbers, and they also fit in with the population who spoke German, dealt with them, bought from them, sold to them. And if we look at East European Yiddish and try to find exactly what region does that resemble, is it Bavarian Yiddish, is it Rhineland Yiddish, and it's not any of those. It's the same problem that students of colonial German have. What kind of German was spoken in Krakow? The answer is it was a mixture. Migrants from various places coming together. So that the picture of small-scale migration and high exposure to a larger community is one that fits well with what we know about language. It also fits well with what we know about religious customs. They preserved the customs of the East German-speaking lands. The Jews did. The names that Jews have are very often similar to Czech names. So the picture we have then is of nothing dramatic, not flight for rescue and safety, but people trying to find a way to keep their heads above water, coming in small numbers, gradually settling in Polish cities, and as the population kept on growing, spreading out into the Polish hinterland. So that the simplest explanation, and one which fits what we know about various migratory patterns, is that this is a migration of individuals that once they came into a place where conditions were good, the population grew and grew and grew. So you might ask, why didn't the population grow and grow and grow in the Czech Republic? The answer is it did. That's why they migrated. Secondly, there are also health conditions, but this, again, for another time. Now, this massive Jewish population that we saw, or we see, or we read about at the end of the 19th century, before World War I, then the Holocaust, this massive population aroused the fascination of many people who wanted to know how and why could there be so many Jews in Eastern Europe. And here, there was a wonderful story that could provide an answer, and that is the story of the Khazars, a nation of brutal, bloodthirsty, violent, some would say criminal population that roamed the steppes of what is like southern Ukraine, southern Russia, Central Asian area in the early modern period. These were a very, very tough and brutal group of people, and they changed world history. Islam, as we know, spread from what is now Saudi Arabia, moved north, conquered what was then, or previously, Babylonia, now Iraq, Baghdad, and was poised to spread up from Iraq through near Afghanistan up to the north into what would be now Ukraine and then Russia. There was one thing that was in their way, the Khazars. The Khazars blocked the spread of Islam, fought them to a standstill, and as a result, the Jews of Russia had to deal with the Russian Orthodox and not with the Russian Islam. But they were a major force. They were allied with the Byzantines, and they were tough fighters who blocked the spread of Islam. Now, the story exists that this nation had a different side to it, and the king of the Khazars was fascinated by the search for truth, and in the search for truth decided to consult with representatives of different religions and invited a Jew, a Protestant, and a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim, and asked each one to present their side. And well, we had noticed that both Islam and Christianity relied on Judaism. So I said, well, if you all rely on Judaism, apparently Judaism is the real religion, and converted, which is a beautiful story for many Jews, because they would like to think that any rational person, considering all the religions of the world, would pick Judaism. There are those who would beg to differ. The Russian story is that when they were given the choice of Islam or Christianity, they asked Islam, what are the laws of Islam? And they were told, well, you can't eat pork, this was a bitter blow, and you can't drink vodka. And they said, no. We're going to go for Christianity. That's the story. But accepting Judaism presents certain problems. It's a little bit difficult imagining these warriors on their horses crossing the prairies to kill some more traders coming through, and then stopping and saying, oh wait, it's time for mincha. Let's get a quick minute, and then we'll go on. Or after they slaughter all the families, they say, wait, but we can't slaughter the sheep, we need a shochet. There's certain questions that you wonder what's going on here. But the story was accepted, and it bounced around in various circles, and for some people, this was a wonderful explanation, that the Jews of Eastern Europe are basically descended from the Khazars, and if we want to know why there were millions of Jews in Eastern Europe, it's because there were hundreds of thousands of Khazars who came to Poland fleeing warfare and then maintained their Jewish lives. Now, the claim itself is very, very problematic. I'll just say this in a minute. There is a geneticist who doesn't like me very much, who wrote an article claiming that the genetics of the Jews and the Khazars are very similar. I read the article, even though I'm not a geneticist, but I took high school chemistry, and I read the article again and again and again, and then I noticed that the author did not mention the size of the sample for the genetic DNA that he used for the study. I thought, this is strange. So how many Jews did you check? So he said he used this material from a laboratory in Estonia, and I wrote to them, and they were very, very helpful. It turned out that he had the DNA of 12 Jews, 8 were males and 4 were females, so that even the white DNA was only on the basis of 8 people. You can't do too much on a sample of 8. But the really interesting part was the DNA of the Khazars, because we don't even know what language they spoke. So how are we going to get DNA data from people about whom we don't know almost anything other than the fact that they were good fighters? So he said, look, we don't have DNA material, that's true. But the Georgians and the Armenians, they also live in Central Asia. And we have a lot of good data about the Georgians and Armenians. So we'll use their data, and it must be similar to that of the Khazars. Unfortunately, the Jews are also descended from the population that came not all that far from Georgia and Armenia, Babylonia. That's another topic. He was happy that he was able to show on the basis of the DNA of 8 Jews and a group of Armenians that the Ashkenazi Jews are descended from Khazars. So this argument, I think, that particular argument is not so strong. What's more serious is that while we have words in even East European Yiddish that come from Western Europe, par, shol, there's a whole string of words. There are almost no words in East European Yiddish that come from a Turkic language. The Khazars almost certainly spoke some Turkic dialect, we just don't know which. But that's where they came, that was their world. We have some words in Yiddish that come from Turkish, like balagan. But balagan comes by way of Polish. The Poles were good at learning from the Turks. And there are various things, like kapeluch also is from the same time. But there are no remnants in Yiddish of Turkic names. There are no remnants, there are no personal names in Yiddish, especially women's names, which are very useful for this. Women's names don't come from Turkey. There's no evidence, and the DNA evidence we have is very clear that the population that is closest to East European Jewry is Moroccan or North African Jewry. What about West European Jewry? The guys doing genetics don't distinguish between East European and West. I begged some of them, just do a separate study of DNA from, let's say, Strasbourg, which is Western Ashkenazi population. They haven't done it yet. But they have done it in North Africa. It's very, very close. So the question of the descent is not much of a question, and the Jews do not seem to be descended from the Khazars. What does remain to be studied is, what about the very question of the conversion? Did the Khazars convert to Judaism at all? It's not important for the genetics of Polish and Lithuanian Jews, but it's a question. And questions should be answered if we can. So, what can one do? The simple thing to do is to go to the sources. And it is indeed quite challenging, because it turns out, this I never thought about, if you want to prove something, all you need is one dynamite source, and here's the proof. George Washington ate krepla. How do I know? He wrote in his autobiography, my Jewish friend gave me krepla. And you can't argue with it. One source, you've got it. But to prove that something did not happen is very difficult. You have to take every possible piece of evidence and show the problems that it has. So I can't do it all. I just have a few minutes left, but I'll point out some of the problems. The best and most important source we have about the conversion of the Khazars is a correspondence between the king of the Khazars, Yosef, and a medieval Jewish writer, political leader in Spain, Chazdai ibn Shaprut. From the Black Sea to Spain, it's a long way. But we have a letter, a back and forth letters between the two. Here, as I was mentioning before the lecture to a friend of mine, I have unique abilities that most scholars don't have. Most of the people who studied this are brilliant, really brilliant, much more than I am. But they didn't teach high school. I'm not so brilliant, but I taught high school. And I know that when a student of mine comes and writes on a paper of his ibid or quotes an obscure Aramaic term or comes in with a beautiful French epigram, then I know he didn't write it himself. I start checking in Wikipedia to see where he copied it from. Now, You have to have common sense. The letter of the king of Khazars is written in a beautiful Hebrew. Beautiful. I'm sure there's not one person in this room, starting with me, who could come near it. It's full of quotes and flowery language. Beautiful piece of writing. This nomad near the Black Sea was writing that. Come on. He got somebody to do it for him. If he did, then he certainly had a great ghostwriter. The truth is, you read the letter, it's beautifully written, and its descriptions of the Khazar lands, the grape vineyards, the olive orchards, are remarkably similar to descriptions of Spain. And the author doesn't mention anything about the Khazars being wandering nomads with their huts and their herds. This doesn't get said. And the most important trade route from the Khazar lands to Persia doesn't get any mention. It basically reflects what a very intelligent person in Spain could have known about the area of the Black Sea. What he knew, he knew. What he didn't know. Now the truth is, we have in Spain a very creative industry of imaginary writing. There are all kinds of texts which are written in Spain to justify family backgrounds, to justify family traditions. If this was forged, it wasn't the first and not the second and not the third. But even forgers had their problems. If it was written in Khazaria, if it mentioned words that were not Hebrew, they should be in what language? A Turkic language. But in this letter, there's a lot more than there should be from Arabic. So you could say that the king of Khazars imported a special scribe from an Arabic-speaking land, but this is getting a little bit complicated. What you could say very simply is that the Jews in Spain needed inspiration, and just as another famous book which was written in Spain inspired the Spanish Jewish mystics, the same way you had a text that was created by a very gifted writer, and it was very, very useful, and which will explain how that letter made its way to Spain and nowhere else. Nowhere else. Yeah, nowhere else. You're funny. You have a person like Maimonides who knew a lot, and he writes in Egypt. He defends Judaism. He writes about philosophy and thought, but he doesn't mention once the amazing conversion of the Jews to Islam. So you could say, oh, his head was in the clouds. But we have a letter written by one of the Gaonim of Babylonia, instructions to a fundraiser. Now, this is the nitty-gritty. When it comes to money, that's where you have reality. He sends the fundraiser off in the direction of the Khazar lands, to the city which was the most important city for trade with the Khazar lands. And he sends the fundraiser, gives them instructions to collect money here and here and here and here, and then come back. He doesn't say, go 100 miles further to the east, and then the Khazars are rolling in gold, and bring some money back. And the simplest explanation is that they were rolling in gold, but they would not have been giving it to a representative of a rabbinical school in Baghdad, because that wasn't their concern. The king of Khazars in the letter talks about his support for Jewish scholarship, but we haven't found one scholar at all ever mentioned who lived in the Khazar lands. So you have to be a little bit suspicious. And then we have sources of a different nature. We have a story called the Schechter document, not because he forged it, because he found it, or it was found for him. And here we have a story about the Khazar general of Jewish descent, whose wife told him he should start being Shomer Shabbat and to eat kosher because he's a good Jew. And he started doing this, and then the king of the Muslims and the kings of the Christians got upset. Why is this general of the Khazars being observant of Jewish law? They threatened warfare. If you think this is nonsense, you're right. And they sent representatives to complain about the behavior of the Khazar general, and they had this dispute, and then the Khazar general said, I heard a rumor. He sent a messenger. They found a cave, and inside was a scroll of the Torah, and the Khazar general took it, and this is the biggest miracle of all. He never even went to Hebrew school. He started reading the Torah without punctuation, and they were convinced, and everybody lived happily ever after. People, why ruin a good story by turning it into a historical source? This is also a great story, but it's a story. You look at the other sources, and they're not better at all. The most fascinating description of the earliest is of a Muslim traveler who never went to the Khazar lands, but he heard a story that the Khazar king had 25 wives, and he reigned for 40 years, and after 40 years he was put to death because he was considered to be an old man. This is a terrible thing to say, that would be me. But the main thing is that things don't work like that. You don't have deadlines for kings after which they're put to death, at least without their, certainly without their agreeing. And then it goes on to get not bizarre but perverse, that after he was put to death, before his body was burned, his wife was taken, and every one of the king's counselors had to sleep with her, and after she had slept with everybody, she was burned. This is just a sick mind. People, no country, no population operated like this. Not Jews, not Muslims, not pagans. It's the way a Muslim writes about pagans who he thinks are past the level of animals. But this is not a reliable historical source. And if you go, and here I'll have to send you to my article if you want more sources, all of the sources are very problematic, mainly because they copy from each other. And in addition, where we should have sources, we don't. Maimonides doesn't mention the Khazars. What's very important is the Byzantines, who are allies of the Khazars, say a lot about the Khazars, but they never mention they're allies with a bunch of dirty Jews. It would have been inconceivable for them. They send missionaries to the Khazars, and they don't even tell the missionaries that the Khazars are Jews, probably because they weren't. So that where you should have sources, we don't. Where we do have sources, they're not serious. And the simplest explanation is that it was a good story. How did it begin? Very possibly it began when somebody called the Khazar a dirty Jew, and somebody heard it and said, oh, I didn't know he was Jewish. How did that happen? It must be he converted, and then stories develop. But even without pinning down the source, the evidence for it is very problematic. So it's kind of exciting to say that the Jewish population of Eastern Europe is largely descended from a population that broke with precedent, embraced the Jewish religion because they sought truth, and found refuge in Poland, and switched from speaking Turkish to speaking Yiddish, and merged with whatever Jews were there. But the realities are far more prosaic. It's a few guys and a few women who wanted to earn a living, heard there was a possibility, they were correct, there really was a possibility, and in dribs and drabs came, the numbers grew, and that was the basis of the Jewish population of Eastern Europe as we know it. Of course, there were exceptions. There were some Sephardim who came. There were people who came later from other regions. But here I'm looking at the large bulk of the population, not the exceptional or fascinating cases. So I have reached my deadline, and I try to keep to a deadline. If there are questions, I'll be glad to try to answer or pretend to answer. Maybe I'll ask you to pick
Sure.
who will do it. And if we don't have time for everything, you can write to me, Stampfer@gmail. I was the first to grab it when Gmail started. I got a nasty letter from somebody who said, "Well, how did you take it?" So I said, "Why did I take it? My name is Stampfer." But then since I'm a friendly person, and this person was lost, I wrote back and I said, "Are you by chance of Hungarian Jewish descent?" And then they were even more upset. No Jewish blood. Okay. So you...
Okay, sir?
Yeah, maybe I missed it. I didn't hear Yehuda Levi mentioned.
Well, Yehuda Levi wrote much later. This is about 200 years after. He wrote about 200 years.
40, right?
Yeah, after the Khazars had been pretty well wiped out, and he read Arabic. He read the literature that was around, and his job was to write philosophy and not to write history. So he took the story and he used it as a terrific frame for the story of what is the basic elements of Jewish philosophy. Had he been a historian, he would have determined the truth that the story had never taken place, and we never would have had a wonderful book of Jewish thought. So basically, Jewish thought, literature, music is much more important than history. Sorry. But you can't go to a philosopher and use it as a historical source. It doesn't work.
Right.
I have two quick questions.
Yes and no.
Okay. I don't. Well, first, thank you for your presentation. It was really excellent. I don't understand why a DNA match requires a sample size much larger than age. You can match a father and son with a sample size of 2 because you're sequencing a very long genome. That's my first question. The second one, it has to do with language. And I'm not quite sure what inference you're drawing from the regional variations in Yiddish. If you go to Quebec City, the French that's spoken there is incomprehensible to anybody who grew up in Paris, and that's 200 years apart. So languages change, and they can change very quickly as populations can grow very quickly.
Yeah, the answer is both that 8 is just small because you can have odd exceptional cases by chance that come into 8 that don't reflect the general population. So if you have, say, two children of converts there, or grandchildren of converts, then that's a quarter of your sample size, so that skews it out. They usually like to have not thousands, but say 40, 50 is the minimum for something serious. I think it actually should be higher. If you're statistically careful, it should be higher.
You're matching on thousands of genes, though, not
Yeah, no,
just
but it's
one.
one person though, and
I
they don't
understand.
know if this person is typical for the population, or is he just, as I said, an outlier? He and the other one are descended from converts, and then all you're done is skewed because you've got such a small sample. The truth is that the minute they tried a bigger sample, they got totally different results. The second thing with regard to language, what's interesting is even the early Yiddish is quite different from Western Yiddish. So that it seems that it had gone through some kind of influence. When you have small populations coming in dribs and drabs from different places, then it makes sense that the languages will mix together. If you have them coming as a group, you expect a higher degree of maintenance, even though there are differences. For example, the Quebec French, as far as I know, reflects a lot of provincial French, because the people who came to Quebec were not the elite of France coming from Paris, but more soldiers and people from the provinces. That's as far as I understand. But I wouldn't build anything just on the dialect. But here, what is nice is that the dialect fits with the religious customs, and it fits with the names, and it fits with the places in which Jews settled. first in Western Poland, then in Eastern Poland. So a lot of things come together and fit. Yeah, I wouldn't want to build a whole theory just on that one factor.
Could I have? Well,
Sorry, this one in the back.
ignoring this,
I have two questions. Number one, you made no mention of the Polish king,
Polish.
who invited Jews to come to his sparsely populated land. Is that apocryphal or not? And secondly, I appreciate your Malthusian interpretation of the increase of the Jewish population geometrically in Eastern Europe, but it brought up a puzzle in my mind. You mentioned, Italy and Jews in Italy. After all, they've been there since, before the time of Jesus, and yet the population of Jews in Italy did not grow, was not very great, did not become very great.
Okay, the first part is a very interesting question, and I'm wondering what exactly is the truth of the story. I've been looking into it. I don't have any solid conclusions, but it's a really good question. Did he really invite the Jews?
Who are we talking about?
I think most of the pious, but it's I sometimes wonder it's too good. I wonder if it's too good to be true. There are things there were forgeries of privileges in Poland, and with regard to the population in Italy, it's the same thing also in the German lands. It seems to me that there was some population control going on, but I don't know why it didn't. Why the population in Italy stayed so limited. I don't know why it stayed so limited in the Czech lands later. That's a separate question. I'm trying to find somebody who wants to study that and give me an answer.
I think the Jews of Italy were expelled several times.
Yeah, but I still think they were using birth control, and a lot.
Sorry, why don't we on this side?
One more, and then we'll come to you.
In 8th century, in Lebanon, existed Jewish.
Yeah,
Jewish
in Haimar.
Yes, but Maimonides never said about this. So your argument about Khazars doesn't work. It never said about this state. It's 70 years it exists.
Well, I'll tell you, again, I wouldn't build a whole theory just by Maimonides. The thing about Haimar is that we have lots of evidence for it from all kinds of different contemporary sources. What's strange about the Khazars is all the evidence is from Muslims who never had lived there, they never worked together with the Khazars. They were enemies, fighting each other. And the Byzantines and the Georgians and the Armenians all said nothing about it, and they had very good reasons to mention it if it would have been true, because the Byzantines were allies, and they would have to, it seems to me, to deal with the fact that they were allies with Jews. And the Babylonian Jews do not mention it either, and they're the ones who were closest. So, again, to build a proof on one thing, one fact, I wouldn't do it. But the realities are that in Haimar, it seems unquestionably that it's true. For example, we have Hebrew inscriptions that refer to the conversion in Haimar, which is near Yemen. But in all of the Kazar lands, there is not one text in Hebrew except for a coin, but I wrote about it. It's complicated. I don't want to start with that. And all the burial customs, everything that we found archaeologically, that has been found archaeologically, doesn't show any Jewish tradition. There was a book published in St. Petersburg, Khazarski graffiti, something like that. So we've got all kinds of graffiti, but nothing Jewish. People get excited every time they find a graffiti of a candle They say, oh, this is a menorah. But a candle is not a menorah. A menorah is a menorah. It's special. And it's just odd, but there's no physical reference. Today, there are physical objects that exist, but these are all factory made to sell to antiquities collectors. There's a big industry of fake antiquities, but the real thing hasn't been found.
Just a point of reference, because I want to use you as a source. What is the cradle of the Khazar civilization today? Where is it located?
Well, it's not really clear. Apparently, it's under a lake near the Black Sea.
I mean, what geographically?
Near the.
I'm asking, I want to go into you say they spoke a Turkic language.
I think we're not sure. We don't have
Do you
any.
have some idea where
We don't
they
have.
started? Point
We
of
don't have.
reference?
We don't have any texts. They didn't leave anything in writing. They were nomads that were floating the area of.
Yeah, but other nomadic cultures have a point of origin.
I'm sure they had a point of origin, but I don't know it.
Okay.
And I don't know anybody who knows it. But I wasn't joking, because the place which is most likely, which was a city, was covered by a lake built by, there was a dam and it covered the city, so we can't even dig there because it's under, 50 feet of water at the bottom of a lake, so there's no.
That's why I want to go into that area. Seljuk Turks are well known and their ancestors are.
Yeah. I wish I could give you more data.
Walter?
Yes, I wonder what you make of the research of Armenian Khazar and Northern Gold. But first, there are two separate subjects. The origin of the Ashkenazi Jews is a totally different subject from the Khazars. So I don't want to touch the Ashkenazim, but I was trained as a Turkologist. So I wonder what you make of the research of Armenian Khazar as a major historian of Ukrainian languages. And Norman Gold, when he collaborated with Gold from the University of Chicago. And I'm thinking particularly of the letter from the Khazar, which is supposedly, according to them, was written by the Parnasim of the Jewish community of Kiev.
Yeah.
That's one, and the Arab geographers, Ibn Pritsak did not believe that the Khazars converted to Judaism in any numbers, but that Jews were attracted there. And therefore Arab geographers mentioned the presence of Muslims as well as Jews in Khazar.
Yeah, the question of the Kievan letter, this is a letter that was found in the Cairo Geniza, and according to Pritsak and Gold, it has on it some runic symbols which were fascinating both for the history of cultural history and also demonstrate that this letter came from Jews of the region. It's a fascinating letter. First off, they both know so much more than I do about these things. And it's not really useful for the question of the conversion, because it's just a letter written by a Jew or Jews in Kiev, maybe, if that's what the city is. At best, it's a letter written in Kiev. So there's no question that there were Jews in Kiev. There was a community, we know about it. But it doesn't say anything if there was a conversion of the Kazars or not, so it's a different question, which is fascinating.
There is a lot of research on the Khazars.
But it's very, Pritsak was very interested in finding material like this.
Yeah.
There's a Hungarian Turkologist who's recently worked about it on this. He came to very differing conclusions. I forgot his name, but it's just a separate question, and that's for real professionals. Now,
The Khazar language, the descendant of the Khazar language is generally considered to be Chuvash.
And somebody wrote an article about Hebrew elements in the Chuvash language. No, there is an article.
I'd like to read the article. The point is that they were pagans until 400 years ago when they became Orthodox Christians, which suggests that the remaining Khazar, the majority of Khazar population, had been pagans.
Yeah,
They were
that's,
only Christianized when the Russians took over the
yeah, that seems pretty clear, so you're right.
Olga? No,
I
you're not
thought
Olga.
that- Oh my God, okay. I've been waving my head like an ISIS. And
boss.
he's ignoring me.
I
They
gotta tell you,
doesn't
there are
like
other
Jews
people.
or old people. I gotta speak. Yeah, what time period precisely are we talking about? And when was the Pale of Settlement in Russia?
Okay, we're talking, the Khazars finished their Khazars went off the stage of world history in, I think, 969, when the king of the Khazars was killed by, I think, by Sviatoslav, and his skull was made into a drinking vessel. And 2 years later, Sviatoslav's skull had the same fate. So that was 969. The Pale of Settlement was the early 19th century, but 17, what was it?
91.
What?
91,
91, okay, sorry, I'm not
To
good.
1917.
Yeah. So that's a big jump.
Olga?
Okay, I'll try again. So, thank you so much for your talk. I understand, I thought that it is a consensus today that there is no, genetic evidence for, Khazars being.
Well, except for the people who think there is.
So, I'm talking about consensus,
Yeah.
So I'm curious if what you're telling now that even the conversion probably didn't exist, the whole thing is apocryphal. Is this a consensus or is this kind of your stuff?
Well,
My context.
that's a very embarrassing question. First off, I'm sure that I'm right. Secondly, I didn't hear it, but it must have been good. Secondly, my friends who had the patience to read through the footnotes and read the whole article, they said it was really a good Shaul. However, what is really fascinating is that every year in Russian there are about 2 or 3 books that come out on the Khazars. And I published my article not only in English but in Russian. And in the West it's a little less. Nobody has referred to my article who's worked in the field. The general approach is to ignore it.
Where's your article?
It's in Jewish Social Studies 2013. So that people who have read it have said that it makes sense and it's coherent. And these are people, who don't believe in other curious stories that float around, miracle stories. I don't want to get into trouble because this is being taped. People who are critical of miracle stories have said, that Shaul, what you're saying makes sense. A friend of mine who teaches in Wroclaw says, you wrote an article about that? And I always thought it was nonsense. I mean, I don't know if you ever heard the story about the kid in Sunday school who comes back home and his father said, well, what did you learn about today? He said, well, I learned about the Jews going out of Egypt. He said, so tell me, what did you learn? Well, they went out and they came to the sea and they built a pontoon bridge and they had tanks on both sides and then they marched them over. They had this kind of a device like at the airport, a moving sidewalk. And the father listens and listens and says, I don't believe that. I don't believe they taught you that in Sunday school. And the kid says, Dad, if I told you what they taught me, you'd never believe it. You have a lot of people who have really, and I felt bad about, they've devoted their lives. I mean, I have some friends in Russia who devoted their lives to this topic, and then some jerk comes and says it's all a fairy tale. I didn't do it to be a jerk, but I did it because this guy, Moshe Gil, preceded me. I should have opened with this. He wrote an article about it, and he said that the conversion never took place. I didn't like the article. It wasn't well written. Then somebody said, Shaul, you're so full of yourself. The guy is 93 years old, writes a creative, original article, and you're kvetching because it's not well written. But I read the article, and nobody responded. And then but he really didn't deal with all of the data. So I worked on it for a long time to deal with everything. But I came to the same conclusion he had. Nobody's ever quoted him. Nobody responded to mine, except last night I was going through the internet. I went to Google Scholar to see if anybody referred to my article, and somebody did. There's a fellow who teaches at St. Andrew's College in England, and he has an article about languages, Scotland, and he has an article about languages. He said cases of conversion are not large in number. One of the only cases is how the Khazars converted to Judaism. See Stampfer's article. And I realized he saw the story of he saw that the name of the article, did the Khazars convert? And that's as far as he got. There is somebody in Israel who said, a good friend of mine, who totally disagrees with me, but we're still friends. I mean, it's just a theory. You don't have to take it personally. He says he wants to write something to show that I'm wrong, but so far he hasn't done anything. So if you're asking, is it the consensus? I don't know. I mean, I think it's true, and people I know who've read it, nobody's tried to argue with it, but nobody's said in public that they accepted it. I wrote to a few people and asked them, shoot me down. I even sent a copy before I published it to Moshe Zahn, this Shlomo Zahn. I sent him a draft. I said, look, people, I have a different opinion than you, but maybe I'm wrong. Please tell me if you see any mistakes. I don't mind. So I made a mistake. But nobody responded.
Right. I would take one more question.
I'm curious if you think that Chazdai ibn Shaprut is just an embellishment of the story, or was Chazdai ibn Shaprut actually taken in by this? And why would anyone make that kind of connect? Why hook up people from across the world?
Well, I think that in Spain, the story was extremely useful. That given a fair playing field, if you compare all the religions, Judaism is best. So for Spanish Jews, this was a very useful story. Whether he wrote the letter which is attributed to him, you have to ask, somebody, a specialist in Spanish Hebrew has to go over it very carefully. What was important for me was that the letter from the king, as to my opinion, is pretty clearly not written in the Khazar lands. And somebody who knows Spanish Hebrew really has to analyze it. I asked a friend of mine, and he said, Shaul, I've got so many things to do, I don't have time to write it. So I have a friend who knows Spanish Hebrew cold. But he said that the language of Joseph's letter doesn't look right, but he didn't want to commit himself in writing.
Okay, thank you all very much for coming. I'd like to thank our speaker, Shaul Stampfer, and I'd like to implore you to, if you enjoyed this, to join YIVO and support us in our endeavors. Thank you.